All right, hello everyone, good morning. Thank you all for coming. My name is Nicholas Hamasevich. I'm the Director of Research and Academic Affairs here at the Korea Economic Institute. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you here to KEI for our academic paper series event today on After Kim Jong-il, North Korea as an Economy. We really do appreciate you coming to this rescheduled event after all the crazy weather we had from Sandy. And we do hope all of your family and friends are okay after all these storms. We're excited to have Mr. Aidan Foster-Carter, Honorary Senior Research Fellow in Sociology and Modern Korea at the University of Leeds, present his paper and provide his thoughts on North Korea's economy after Kim Jong-il. And we are also thankful for his flexibility, understanding, and good spirits this week. The timing of Kim Jong-il's death caused a lot of rethinking, including a rethinking of the 2012 calendar. For the rethinking of this 2012 schedule, first, Kim Jong-il's death started this year of transitions and elections a couple weeks early, a year that would have been bookend nicely by democratic presidential elections in Asia, with Taiwan's election in January and South Korea's in December. Second, we had to have something on Kim Jong-il's death in our academic paper series, but as of December 19th last year, when it was announced that Kim Jong-il had died, we had already completed all of our 2011 paper series, as well as selected the papers for the first half of this year. Therefore, in the second half, 2012, our academic paper series will have two papers examining North Korea after Kim Jong-il's death. And today, we appreciate Aidan Foster-Carter starting us off and tackling the economic aspects for us. For the rethinking general after Kim Jong-il's death, the US, South Korea, and other countries affected by North Korea now have to figure out how to approach North Korea without Kim Jong-il. And one of the major ways to assess this transition in North Korea is to look at how North Korea will deal with its devastating economy. So we are pleased to have a veteran North Korea watcher in Aidan Foster-Carter write a paper for us and provide his assessment on the North Korean economy after Kim Jong-il. And just to highlight some of his credentials, amazing credentials, he is the Honorary Senior Research Fellow in Sociology and Modern Korea at Leeds University of Leeds. Longtime analyst for the Economist Intelligence Unit, writing the quarterly reports and forecasts for North and South Korea. Also with Oxford Analytica. He's also been a lecturer at the University of Hull, at the University of Dar es Salaam, and also was a visiting associate professor of sociology at the University of California at Santa Cruz. You see a lot of his writings, especially with the CSIS, Pacific Forum, Asia Times, and elsewhere. He's been a consultant for multinational corporations, international organizations like the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and UNICEF, and for various other organizations as well. He's written several books, including Korea's Coming Unification and North Korea After Kim Il-sung. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Aidan Foster-Carter.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. How near do I need to go to this mic? Is this okay? Because I'm probably going to be, in all my years, I noticed the word veteran, you know you're getting old, but I appreciate it. In spite of that, I've never mastered the art of simply talking, so I will be sort of looking here and there. Otherwise, I'm liable to go off like a Taepodong missile, somewhat unguidedly. Thank you very, very much, Nicholas, for that kind introduction. It is a huge pleasure to be here. On the basis of this invitation, I had planned a whirlwind week. I didn't realize it was going to be quite so literal, but hey, we got off lightly here, or I certainly did. Having to reschedule is not such a big deal. I present this paper with all necessary humility. I probably never sound humble, partly because I seem to have ended up doing quasi-journalistic things. They don't want you to sound like the goddess Kali on the one hand, on the other hand, then again, and so on. You have to sound glib, you have to produce the sound bites, you have to sound more certain than you really are. I do not claim expertise. It's been widely said by many people, there is no such thing as a North Korea expert. I'm just some guy who has been doing it for a long time, time. And I just recently wrote a paper suggesting I've been getting it wrong for a very long time. We all try, those of us who follow North Korea, to do what we can. I'm conscious that this particular paper, which you do have in front of you, is probably underachieved in particular ways. I approached it with huge gusto and enthusiasm and realized about 7,000 words in the first draft I was sort of writing a book. And we had to cut all that and start again. So what you actually have here, and I will spend the time, I will try not to be dull and directly read it, or not very often, but I will try and give you a guide to what it is. I fear it is not what I would have wanted to present exactly. But it's what I've tried to do is to emphasize aspects which I think perhaps are neglected. Obviously, there are people who know far more about this than I do, and some of them are in the room. In a sense, I'm taking their work as read. So let me tell you what the various bits that you have here actually are. Starts with a series of quotations, each of which I hope you will agree with me is interesting. Various things that various North Koreans, a number of them leaders, called Kim, have said about the economy at various times. And what I'm trying to set up where I do that, you may have had a bit of a chance to look at some of it, Kim Il-sung in early 1994 saying, "We opened already." And also, it's anathema for me to follow others. I'm trying to set up some points which I make briefly, it all has to be briefly, because it's a short paper, in the introduction, which seem to me, the point I'm trying to make is about North Korean discourse. I want to put out the idea that North Korea, or what do we mean when we say North Korea? The North Korean leadership, the public face-off, possibly doesn't get economics. Now, that may seem a very radical thing to say, and I'm aware also that I've turned into a kind of old-fashioned Kremlinologist, and I mainly follow it from outside. So I will particularly welcome comments from those of you who've been there more often than I have, more recently than I do, telling me that I'm wrong about this, and that there are professional economists who do conduct a discourse, even in private, which is recognizable to the rest of us, which is the same as the discourse that every other country in the world has, where, in James Carville's famous phrase for Bill Clinton, it's the economy, stupid. So I have this puzzle, particularly with the really interesting quotation from Kim Jong-il, which I think if you're in the literature, you're in the field, you will probably know already. Obviously not part of his normal canon. So in December 1996, just when the famine is beginning to bite, he basically goes and has a wine in this speech at Kim Il-sung University that Daddy told me I don't do economics. It's not what... I'm almost tempted to paraphrase this in a gendered way, actually. You know, real men don't do economics. It's the party, stupid. It's the army, stupid, in his case. And I think that's a big mistake. There's other circumstantial evidence. It's established that when he was taken to Shanghai and saw everything, that what came out of that? Train more architects. That is what philosophers call a category mistake. And I genuinely think, and I would cite also, I do cite later on, Kim Jong-un, who's now, of course, like his father and his grandfather, producing, or someone is writing these leaden treatises. There's a kind of concern with the cosmetic and so on, with the appearances of things. So I have all these worries. I put it in more detail than I have time for speaking right now in the paper in various places. But so a concern that that among the many burdens that the North Korean regime gives itself, quite apart from anything any of the rest of us give it, in the task of moving towards a more modern, normal, sensible economy, is a form of discourse in which you can't talk straightforwardly about economics as if it were a science. There's also a very strong voluntaristic element. As I say here, if ever the DPRK media do broach matters economic, it's as homiletics rather than science. I originally had a phrase that I think economics in North Korea is like the Victorians and sex. Everybody knows it's there, but you don't really talk about it in polite company. And I'm throwing these things out, and I hope if people think I'm wrong and I'm exaggerating this, you'll say so. And then another point I make in the introduction is that in a curious way, sometimes we as analysts mirror the North Koreans' relative neglect of economics. I mean, this is only a relative point. It's just that in terms of the broader discourse about North Korea, heaven knows, for a country that we always complain rightly, that we never know enough about. There's an awful lot of different things to talk about. So the nuclear discourse is predominant. The human rights discourse, quite rightly, takes its place also. And it's not I'm not saying, obviously, there is no discussion of the North Korean economy. There is. But maybe we don't think enough about North Korea as an economy. That's why I was particularly grateful, and I thought it was wise, even apart from my being a beneficiary, that when KEI decided on how to respond to the death of Kim Jong-il, to commission a paper on the economy specifically. Because at the end of the day, if you're not an economy, what are you? I suspect that in North Korea, that's sort of not a rhetorical question. They come straight back and say, well, we're an army, we're a nuclear power, and there's all that. But all this has to be paid for. Anyway, it's sort of, I would hope that is obvious. Doesn't mean that my interpretation of it is necessarily correct. So what do I then try and do on the basis of this? Well, I start by try and look both backwards and forwards. You can't really say what North Korea is going to do or should do if you don't have some idea where it's coming from. And I propose rather rashly, because I'm probably out of my field here, but I'm a bit of jack of all trades anyway, and always with the risk of master of none. I try an economic history periodization. So I'm on page 2 now, and see what you think of this. I mean, I found an author I wasn't familiar with, the South Korean economic historian Ja Myung-soo, who, in the quotation up there on the top of the right-hand column of page 2, has this very stark account of the Korean economic longue durée, as you might say, Malthusian stagnation till 1910. I can imagine some people taking issue with that. There's always the urge to say there was stuff actually, the idea that nothing happened before the Japanese arrived is deeply unpleasant and maybe untrue. Then the colonial period, which is when stuff started, and then he says the post-colonial decades where, the way he puts it, which is too simple, the paths diverged right away. The South went up and the North went back. That is too, I mean, I don't know how he put it that starkly. As we know, I don't have time to dwell on it here, North Korea did have a period of economic development. I got into all this, some of you will know, and I've confessed it many times. Why did an Englishman aged 19 get into North Korea in 1968? Well, I was a fellow traveller, wasn't I? I was a screaming leftist. I read a book that said how well they were developing, and they were. Even Nicholas Eberstadt, who can hardly be accused of economic bias in that direction, in his very scholarly work has shown how the North was ahead. So Professor Jar's account is obviously too simple. The Great Leap Backwards, as I go on to call it, came a bit later. There were 20 years of economic progress, and some of us got very encouraged by that. Zoom over a few things, and I'll go down. Here's the periodization I suggest. There's this wonderful book edited by Kim Sun-ju, which sometimes you pick up a book and you think, this is the book I've been waiting for. I've often wondered, specifically as an Englishman, I've thought, what about North Korea with a small n as opposed to North Korea with a large n? What about the regional, provincial aspects? And I've often wondered if it was a bit like my country. If you imagine that there'd never been the partition that, again, this is dreadful oversimplification. The south of England is where the power is and the wealth is. And the South sort of think they are it. And they think that Northerners, I've lived in both the South and the North of England, the Northerners are peasants. But the North had the minerals, and so come the 19th century, the North has the industry, so the North thinks the South are a bunch of softies. These are not social scientific terms. I'm obviously exaggerating. And what I get from a much more scholarly book edited by Professor Kim is that there was a bit of that. North Korea with a small n before partition, it was a rather marginal sort of neglected place. You apparently couldn't even apply for the scholarship exams and stuff at a certain time. So long before partition, the three traditional provinces of Northern Korea were already a realm apart, peripheral, far from the centre of things, marginal and discriminated against. I may be wrong, but I've hardly seen any accounts of contemporary North Korea which go there at all, which think there's anything to be said about that. There's also regional issues within North Korea, of course, no time for that. So then, by contrast, secondly, the colonial era did jolt Northern Korea into centrality. Northern Korea became important in ways that I don't have time to read it through, but this is familiar in broad outline, the beginnings of industrialization. That's where the minerals were and are, the hydropower and so on. And Korea as a whole became a more connected economy, heavy industry in the north, light industry and farming in the south, and also international integration. Obviously, none of this directed by Koreans, mainly towards Japan, but also to some extent towards northeastern China, especially during the brief but interesting existence of Manchukuo. So then, suddenly, in 1945, another wrenching reorientation. The peninsula is severed completely after 1953. The ties to North Korea's economic ties to Japan are lost. And now this economy, battered economy, is swiveled around to face north, and the USSR in Japan's former role, if no doubt more benignly. And although Kim Il-sung wouldn't join Comecon and flirted with China politically, for 40 years Moscow was the main trade partner, investor, and so on. I don't know if I have to revise that, because on the plane coming over, I read a very interesting collection of documents from NKIDP about the China-DPRK relationship in the 50s and 60s, in which it's the same Professor Shen, I think, whose talk is tomorrow, rescheduled, insists that the Chinese gave as much as the Russians did, which I wasn't aware of, and maybe it was just for that period, so still. So then there's that. There's, if you like, you could call it the Soviet period. As we all know, that again ended very abruptly. The Russians pulled the plug. I keep hoping somebody somewhere, maybe KEI, but it's broader, so maybe Wilson Center, would organize a conference. I'm not sure if there's ever been one. If there is, Bradley Babson will know, as to how the different countries that had the Russians pull the plug on them in 1990-91 responded, bringing together Vietnamese, Cubans, Mongolians, and if any North Koreans would come, because obviously they were all in the same boat, all the others adapted, and again, another of my big question marks for modern North Korean history is, why didn't North Korea adapt? They must surely have realized, unless they believed their own sort of Juche fantasies, that their economy was dependent on Soviet friendship oil, to name nothing else, and that they would have to, when that stopped, they would have to do something different. But as far as we can see, there were certainly no effective policy reactions, and we know what happened. GDP went down, the Great Leap Backwards, famine, and so on. So then there's that phase, and from this point onwards, the phasing is not nearly as clear-cut as 1945 was a watershed, 1990-91 as a watershed. But we may, so post the 90s, I sort of characterize as China and, in the Sunshine period, South Korean competition, and we may now be in a fifth phase, but it is less clear-cut. Since 2008, when the South Koreans sort of took their bat away for a while, which I do think was unwise, and almost unopposed China has steadily increased its economic and other influence. So maybe it's the Chinese period, but with elections due in South Korea, then maybe South Korea is going to get back in the game. I'm conscious that I'm probably going to have to go faster and skip things. So just again, telling you what's in the paper. A very summary section of the Great Leap Backwards, mentioning, I've written more about these things elsewhere, I mean, how promising some of us, we were wrong in the end, but it didn't look so wrong at the time, thought that North Korea looked. So in other words, North Korea was once an economic story. It wasn't just a nuclear story or a gulag story, though God knows it was always a gulag story too, but there was an economic story as well. And I have written elsewhere in a short paper for 38 North and in a longer paper for the Asan Institute, which I kind of hope they'll bring out at some point, about one of my hobby horses, which is the sheer irrationalities of the North Korean system and how multiple they are, on top of the familiar corn iron problems of all, why all centrally planned economies in the end have to slow down. There's the hypermilitarization, there's the grand unproductive edifices, the mausolea, the Ryugyong, with or without glass, disastrous agricultural policies, whims of the leaders, ostriches, vinylon, lots of arbitrary interference. I mean, I had one time, and in other papers I've illustrated all that. Again, this is a way that the North Korean regime, and specifically the North Korean leadership, burdens itself by not doing productive things, by doing unproductive things, or even counterproductive things, and, as I say, failing to react to the body blow of 1991. However, I will now take a sip. Hopes for the future. I then have a section trying to be forward-looking, and this is probably sort of fairly obvious in a way. I mean, what would they do? What would they concentrate on if they thought as an economy? It's fairly obvious, I think, and some of it is even being done, so I go through the things. The minerals. Isn't everybody excited about the minerals? Particularly in South Korea. I have to say, it doesn't actually belong to you guys. The Goldman Sachs report, which I have other problems with, I mean, it's nice. It's nice to see that. I think I said vampire squid as Pollyanna, which is a bit unkind. But yeah, you can wax optimistic. I know there's also a series of research projects in Kinu trying to get away from the, oh my God, it'll be awful and it'll cost a fortune school of unification. So it's interesting always to have contrarian thought, but to have a whole premise on how, you remember the headlines, how a unified Korea could be bigger than Japan. Well, maybe that's going to be easy. Maybe not bigger than China. Anyway, it was all going to be wonderful. And, you look at the subtext and it presupposes a nice, peaceful unification. Well, great, okay, but it's just kind of a big assumption to make. And then I've seen some stuff from South Korea, I'm conscious I am, of course, in an institution that has some connections with the South Korean government, so I don't mean to be too critical, but which will more or less imply, I think this was the Kinyu project, that we shouldn't worry too much about unification because the North's minerals are going to pay for it. And I did slightly wonder what the North would think about that. But the minerals are important, obviously. It's not wrong to be, they've always played a part, and in their export particularly, as well as for home use in the North Korean economy. But I'm very intrigued by just one thing that Kim Jong-un has written in the first major treatise, which was about land management, a phrase that seems to cover a lot of things. And I will quote it here. It's at the bottom of page 4. Some people are now attempting to develop the valuable underground resources of the country at random, on this or that excuse, to export them for not a great sum of foreign exchange. This is an attitude lacking in far-sightedness and an expression of lack of patriotism. I mean, who knows what precisely is behind that? Maybe some of you know, but I imagine that is not unrelated to what look fairly clearly like moves of the party and the cabinet to re-establish authority over bits of the economy which have managed to get into the hands of the Korean People's Army. And I have just one little phrase here I would like to read to you from the top of the next column, because I think there's stuff that people may have missed. Because nowadays, thanks to the internet, you can all watch when North Korea opens a new port, and I commend you to go to KCNA. Sadly, and if you live in South Korea, the government doesn't yet let you. I wish it would for research purposes, and to have a laugh now and then. So the opening of Tancheon Port, and of course this was before that area in the northeast, that mineral-rich area, was hit by flooding, as it was very badly. But there it is with these tiny little cranes, compared to anywhere else in Asia just about now. One can only imagine how different it would have been if South Korea had been involved. And I won't bang on about this because I've written about it elsewhere at 38 North, had the current government, soon to be the ex-government, simply carried on with what had been agreed at the second Pyongyang summit. It included joint mining things. I think we would have been in a better place. But I'm aware that's a wider argument, which I'm very happy to have, but I'll try and stick to there. But so the North Koreans are doing Tancheon on their own. And it just doesn't really look very 21st century. Indeed, a lot of North Korea, apart from bits of Pyongyang, don't look very 21st century. So then there's export zones. I've got quite a long section here. I'm obviously just going to rush through. Rason, Rajin Sonbong, as it used to be, it had the word free in its title for a while. It's been around for nearly 20 years, and I don't know whether the North Koreans themselves internally do evaluations. They must do something like that, or whether you just wait for the next order from on high. But what were they thinking of when they didn't even pave the roads to the border? And it's only now that, since China has been involved for the last year or two, that the Chinese have taken this place by the scruff of the neck, have put the money in. I gather they're going to do the same with power supply. Maybe it's already happened. And, I can see a future for that place. But somehow the North Koreans, whether they never quite dared, I had some encounter with people who've been involved through UNDP, and again, there are people here who know much better than I, that they're North Koreans, although they did things that were radical by the rest of North Korean standards, it was never really enough. And again, under my heading of do they get it, do they grasp that to open, Kim Il-sung, we opened already, opening is competitive, opening is not just, this feels very radical to me because it's very different than how I used to be, and I'm not really comfortable with it, which I'm sure that's true, but we've actually, if anyone, to open is not the same as, and anybody's going to come. If people are going to come, then you have to be competitive. It's perhaps rather obvious. Then there's the Shinri-ju experience, the whole Yang Bin thing, which was terribly peculiar, wasn't it? Did the North Koreans really did Kim Jong-il personally get taken in by some guy, think you could hand over a whole zone and not consult with China? Clearly, and the Chinese showed him very carefully. Various others, there was talk of bonded warehouses in Wonsan and in Nampo. I'd love to know where that came from and why it actually didn't happen. Then I've got stuff about Kumgang, obviously, hoping that will reopen again. And the Kaesong zone, of which I am a fan. I much endorse the very useful report by Patrick Cronin from CNAS recently. It may be rather nonsensical for South Korea to nominally ban North-South trade, but make an exemption of the Chonan. But I'm very glad that happened. I write here, one is all the gladder in dark times that this one candle still flickers, lighting a better way for the two Koreas to relate. I am kind of hoping that since in the exciting presidential election imminent in South Korea. All three candidates, whatever else may divide them, but they all in their different ways seem to want to reach out again to Pyongyang, and goodness knows that can be difficult given what the North Koreans have done and what the North Koreans have said and continue to say. They don't even like Park Geun-hye anymore, for all that she was up there once. But I think I'm conscious, even as I say this, that we may be in a very different place next year, and I'm suggesting a far-sighted South Korea would create 2, 3, or many kaesongs. Although I then go on to mention there were a lot of false dawns. I came across a page on the People's Korea, you know, the organ of Chongryon in Japan, from the late 90s, and they obviously, those guys, because a lot of them invested in North Korea, probably lost their shirts as well. I mean, they were always hopeful when the North seemed to be opening, and you get a slight sense of déjà vu. I noticed there was a similar article on the excellent NK News by an Italian whose name escapes me for the moment, saying, obviously young, so unlike me, he doesn't actually remember all this stuff first time around, that hang on, we seem to be talking about North Korean opening since about the 1980s. Yes, we have, actually. Someone should go over all that. Very briefly going on, processing and outsourcing, obviously you can do that. A lot of that, again, the Chongryon people pioneered that. I'm not sure whether the history of all that's really been written. South Korean firms used to do quite a bit of it. They are the ones, the unlucky ones, because of the Lee Myung-bak administration's, shall we say, sort of dualistic policy post-Chonan. Those guys have all lost their shirts because they weren't in the Kaesong zone. And maybe that's a shame, we shall see. The Chinese are probably there. There are some European firms, I have examples there. Export of labour. This seems to be a growing trend, doesn't it? For years it was the lumberjacks in Siberia. Now they do other work in Vladivostok. In the footnotes I've got a quote out, call the Korean, you know, and in my country it's call the Poles. You know, if you want a good construction job done, you call the Poles. They've actually improved things very much. But so you call the in Vladivostok, you call the North Koreans. And now there are labour group brigades in the Middle East, and the big-scale stuff, it looks as if they're, as well as the North Koreans who individually and illegally have found their way into China to work, among other things, it looks as if there are actual contracts being signed formally for labour to go into northeast China. My other two forward-looking sessions, I'm having to be brief on all of this, are, you might think, slightly utopian. I still like the quotation from the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, pessimism of the intelligence, optimism of the will. He died in Mussolini's jail, so you may think it didn't really work for him. But if you're working on North Korea, you know, there's a lot of pessimism of the intelligence, so you kind of need the optimism of the will. So here's my two penneth, basically. North Korea is a mass market. I mean, you might laugh now. I mean, a few mobile phones, that's it. But it's 24 million people. I keep telling both North and South Koreans, yours is not a small country, and I never want to be told by any Korean ever again that yours is a small country. Neither Korea is small. North Korea at the moment is a small economy. But 24 million people, I mean, some of us, again, are old enough to remember when the South Korean market was not large because purchasing power was low, and the Chinese market was not large, and look at them now. If the right things are done, and I'm conscious it's a very big if, North Korea will be a big market eventually. And the perhaps even more, perhaps slightly less utopian one, and my subsection is called the Real Korean Hub. There was a time, I'm sure you will remember, when the word hub was used. Somebody in Seoul discovered the word hub, and for several years we heard nothing but hubbub, I call it. I thought, like a lot of things, I shouldn't say pivot, should I? But terribly controversial. There are certain terms, economic democratization. You poke it and it crumbles or it bursts, or you're never quite sure what it means. But it was, I loved the force of it, because it kind of countered all the old shrimp among whales stuff. Hang on, we're in the middle of stuff here. And so my possibly slightly contentious point is, if you look at the map, including those famous maps of the peninsula in the dark, which everybody has seen, and we know which bit is in the dark, but which bit's in the middle? Which is the real Korean hub? Which is the Korea that has borders with, South Korea? I'm giving it away, aren't I? China, Russia, and Japan not far away. Well, it's North Korea. North Korea has got location. They don't seem to do hardly a thing, except for Rason, which indicates that they're aware of this and its benefits and so on. But potentially you have to think long term. And so I have this probably slightly ecstatic thing. Well, it's that ecstatic. But, you're hopefully in my lifetime, certainly, as you will get on a train in Seoul and you'll overnight up via. You'll have breakfast in Seoul, lunch in Pyongyang, and you'll have overnight, and you'll be in Beijing in the morning if you don't like flying. And the trucks. I think, in terms of the future economic geography, I think the western side, with the exception of Rason, which will obviously be very useful for Heilongjiang and eastern Jilin, I think Western North Korea is going to do fine in a number of ways. I'm not so sure about the future of Hamhung after Vinalon, but anyway. Then I have a section which is all too short for the importance of it, I think, called Going Straight, which is just a reminder that North Korea's previous encounters, there's a history of all of this, encounters with international business haven't always been positive, that's putting it mildly. Two things which, again, I'm old enough to remember the 1970s when I was still a fan. And two things happened which were mildly embarrassing. One is they borrowed a lot of money, nothing wrong with that. They didn't pay any of it back. There was quite a lot wrong with that. Okay, other countries defaulted, but no one ever defaulted so kind of comprehensively, catastrophically, completely. And I now think deliberately that may be contentious, because they thought it was a smart thing to do to get all this money for nothing. But anyway, for whatever the reason, they did it. And secondly, the state crime, which I think I've written about this elsewhere, as people try and play it down, because obviously it's awkward when you're trying to talk about nukes and stuff, but it was there. You just read the book by Eric Cornell, who was the first Swedish ambassador, and they did it first, to those lovely, friendly Scandinavians who just established relations with them. So you have to think, what was going on exactly? I think it's probably stopped now. And obviously North Korea is now a more diverse subject. So if one does find this stuff, and North Korean diplomats were jailed in Sweden for smuggling cigarettes only last year, it may well be private enterprise. But in the 70s, it wasn't private enterprise. So there is a kind of image situation to be, that stuff is not, we didn't make it up because we were wanting to demonize North Korea, as some people say. It happened. We have to, I would have thought most investors have to be very sure that it's not happening. And then so you get the Xi'an case. You get this one Chinese firm, and maybe there's another side to the story, but the North Korean account isn't very good. You get a Chinese firm saying, we were taken advantage of, we were diddled, we were rooked, and so on. So all that stuff fairly obviously has to stop if any of the things I was looking at just before are really going to happen. I'm conscious of the passing of time. I have to go faster than I would wish, but hopefully you can read it if you want to. A section trying to evaluate Kim Jong-un so far, new leaf or new broom. It's very early days. I think you have to give the kid time, I'm tempted to say, because obviously probably economics may not be the main thing on his mind either. One rather wishes it was. But obviously the political succession, surely there is stuff behind the scenes that we're not seeing. Departure of Ri Yong-ho, there may be more of that. He probably sees it as mainly political. I look at how you can't always take North Korean headlines at face value. So the article which was headlined, "To expect change from DPRK is foolish ambition." Actually, when you read through, because I'm preoccupied with discourse, among other things, I'm intrigued by the ways the North Koreans will allow themselves to change. And on my more optimistic moments, I think that even when Kim Jong-un is saying we must be endlessly loyal to Kim Il-sungism, Kim Jong-ilism, and Kim Jong-il said above all we must serve the people, I'm kind of hoping that's a sort of way through for saying therefore we must prioritize the economy. But you may say that I'm clutching at straws. I don't think it's at all clear-cut yet. About his leadership style, it does worry me a bit, and several people have made this point. Why doesn't he go to factories? Poor old Choi Yong-rim, who's almost 3 times his age, these hard-working octogenarians, like Kim Yong-nam does it on the foreign front, Premier Choi does it on the... He goes to the factories, he tours the country, the stuff that Kim Jong-un does. He goes to the shops, and he goes to the fun fairs. And okay, what's the image? We're having fun, we've all seen the pictures and things. Fun image is good, but it's not productive. None of that's productive. All that's got to be paid for from somewhere. And I would kind of like to see him go to a factory and for that matter, tour the flood-damaged areas and things like that. I've got a section on the agricultural reform which seems not to have happened. It is, you may say it's early days. You may, from a different longue durée point of view, say it's very late in the day. Goodness knows they should have been doing this stuff 30 years ago. But given the political transition, it may be next year. So I'm trying to keep an open mind on that one. And then it ends probably ends in the middle. It could easily have gone on, but trying to end on an optimistic note. I look back at something which, again, I don't think I may be wrong. You may all know this already. That there's bits of stuff that I don't think are widely known, and one is North Korea's, as I thought in the past, encounter with UNEP. I've just discovered, I read something this morning, I haven't had time to digest, that it is a continuing relationship, the Environment Programme. And I remember nearly a decade ago reading this book-length report produced by North Koreans under the prodding, or with North Koreans, I don't know the exact authorship, under the prodding of a UN agency, which admits to problems. It meets all the stuff I was complaining about at the beginning of this, about the discourse. 5 separate sections, forest depletion, declining water quality, air pollution, land degradation, biodiversity. Obviously, it doesn't say we had a really terrible government and that's why all this happened. I'm not expecting things that the North Koreans can't deliver, but it's honest. And several named North Koreans, hopefully still with us, who knows, are on this document. And I think for those who, unlike me, have had involvement in various times in the post-famine situation on the food front, nutrition, health, and so forth. Although the relationships with the international organizations haven't always been easy, I'm assuming, I'd love to see this written about, and if it exists and I missed it, I'd love to be told that there are North Korean specialists, and I know with at least some of the nutrition surveys and so on, though I know they did get embarrassed about some of the findings, but I mean, at least at a time, you had a government prepared to take ownership. And I think that's where I will end and invite questions, because I think that's a hopeful note, and in a way it sums up the possibly slightly bitty and unintegrated things that I want to say here, that you need the North Korean government, whoever it is, it needs to take ownership. It needs to you need an honest reckoning, even within the own ideology, even if it's difficult to admit to errors if you've built up your leaders in this way, but to take ownership of the problems, to recognize that it is the economy stupid, because if they don't move forward that way, then I fear for them. And I end with a rather apocalyptic quote from Peter Hayes, who fears for them even more than I do. On that note, I'll leave it over to you, and I would very much welcome your questions. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Aidan. So we'll take questions now. We have microphones, so please wait for those to come around. Raise your hand, state your name and organization, and ask a question. So first question, how about up here in the front with Ambassador King? All the way up here in the front, Justin.
Gosh, the Ambassador King. Not worthy, not worthy.
The King.
The King. No, we have those in my country.
It's a great name. I'd be interested in terms of how do we deal with the problem of corruption. You mentioned it briefly, but it's very clear that corruption is one of the real limits on economic development in North Korea. Just before the visit of Jong Sung-taek in China in August, there was a very interesting article published in the Chinese press talking about a Chinese company that had gone involved in mineral exploitation, lost its
That's
share.
Xi'an, yes.
Yeah. I don't think it was accidental that it was published. The Chinese recognize the problem, but you've got a society that's basically built on corruption. And how do the North Koreans deal with this issue in order to try to bring in more foreign investment?
I think that is extraordinarily different. I mean, corruption covers a multitude of sins. I haven't again seen sort of like a history of corruption in North Korea. Maybe it's not possible to write it yet, but it's a phenomenon, I guess, of the last 20 years. I think whatever North Korea's defects were before, that probably wasn't it. And I think there's an extraordinary dilemma for policy. In a bit of one of the many bits that I skipped in the paper, I note that whenever North Korea at various times has had a particular individual, Kim Dae-hyun, Kim Jong-un, who are the sort of the face of dealing with the outside world, they've all, almost without exception, come to a bad end, usually accused of corruption. Kim Jong-un is thought to have been executed. Kim Jong-un was in Washington, wasn't he, at a certain time? I have no idea whether the accusations are true. I presume that those people have more opportunities for it. It must be very difficult for them. But one obviously is not allowed to say in any context that corruption of the right kind may be necessary. I mean, you're going to have to offer all sorts of incentives to this regime, which of course raises another thing, because of course it's quite properly within the meaning of the act under UN sanctions for this and that malefaction and so forth. But I would have thought at the least to know who you are dealing with. It's like, you can see probably that I'm floundering with this, because I'm lucky or unlucky enough not to work in government. I never confront these issues in my daily life, but you presumably at least want to make sure there is not a multiplicity of channels. One of the minor but serious worries, as far as I can grasp, is when you occasionally hear stuff about there's a 10-year plan, there's this and that new institution, I've forgotten the name of it, begins with a T, and who are these? And then you hear from quite well-informed people like Chosun Exchange that there's actually, or has been, a multiplicity of different groups touting, and it doesn't mean necessarily that they're corrupt, but I can imagine those who think, well, this and that group is my way into North Korea. I might pay a fee they'll probably ask for a fee and so forth. So if at the very least it almost sounds like a retrogressive, go back to some sort of a state monopoly. But I'm conscious, sir, I've not given you a good answer. It may be, I can't say it's the least of our worries, because everything with North Korea is a worry, and your particular bailiwick is a whole other one again, isn't it? But it's a huge problem.
All right, others. I'll just go straight across
Sorry, I
here.
must try and give shorter answers.
We'll go to Brad Babson first, right here.
All right, yes. Thank you for coming.
Okay. I didn't hear the word market once. So
I did use it, no, but you didn't hear it enough, that's true.
I'd like to get your insights into what you see to be the impact on the political economy challenges that are arising because of the expanding role of markets. And also, the flip side of that is how you interpret the growing role of Chang Son-taek in terms of his influence on the economic policy and the direction of their strategies for dealing with their problems.
Okay. No, it's true. I uttered the word market, but it was in a completely different context. It's true in terms of the bits that I chose to write about here, and even more the bits that I chose to extract for the talk. I left out all of that, which is not meant to imply, obviously, it isn't hugely important. My sense is that maybe again this is just a Gramscian hope, that the redenomination exercise of now almost 3 years ago was the last gasp of the old guard trying to stop, if you mean the markets, the markets that have grown up in order that North Koreans actually stay alive. I'm sure, again, there are people here who are better informed than I am. I would love to know if there are data as to whether, since if you build buildings for these things, you allow they exist. I mean, do we know anything about how they are taxed and that sort of thing? My sense is that markets are now here to stay. Part of my problem on the discourse front is I would love to hear, and I do not rule out that it is politically possible that we will hear, say in the next year or so, somebody in the government saying something about them, saying something nice about them. I don't see why that's completely impossible. I mean, you can find enough going back in the day to Kim Il-sung and farmers' markets that every now and then things were actually said in their favor. On Chang Son-taek, I don't feel I have, I'm doing all this from outside. I never have access to classified things. I don't think I know any more than anybody else. I've never been quite clear how to classify his own bent. I mean, his power, I think, is without doubt. But I'd always wished I could have had a chance to go to Seoul and talk to the people who talked to him when he was on that trip with Park Pong-ju and others a few years ago. And my sense was what I did read and hear about that was that Park Pong-ju was the guy who is kind of back with us, isn't he, in some role or other, is the one unambiguous North Korean reformer we can identify. He was careful, but he loved being in Seoul. He was taking notes all the time. He was quoted saying, "I wish I had eyes in the back of my head so I could write down more of this stuff." Whereas Jang was a very guarded presence, but was clearly the guy in charge. But again, you probably know more than I about that. I've never been clear that we can say Jang equals reform. I've never been clear on that, and some people have argued the opposite, haven't they?
Great. Yeah, right next to Mr. Warren.
Thank you, Rob Warren. You mentioned just briefly that you thought that perhaps Kaesong could be replicated and thereby a greater South Korean presence in North Korea, and particularly in development of labor and manufacturing. Would you evaluate Kaesong, and how might that be replicated?
Sure. I mean, again, I think a lot of work has been done on that, and Cronin's report, and there's at least one book in English out of South Korea and so forth. I evaluate it positively in the sense that, there's some stuff in the paper which I skipped about the origins of it, which are not unimportant. That apparently Chung Ju-yong never dared hope for Kaesong, never asked for Kaesong, I'm going for Haeju. They tried to fob him off with Shinri-ju. He said, the logistical lines are just too long, and then they gave Kaesong. And what's his name? Kim Jong-un, in his recent book, his memoir, sort of Sunshine's Eminence Grise, perhaps, there were maybe a few of them, said, we couldn't believe it when they gave us Kaesong. You know, it's right on the border. Can you imagine what the KPA felt about that? And I dare to say, perhaps controversially, so I perhaps shouldn't have left that out, in the current furor about the NLL and stuff, I mean, perhaps ignores the fact that if there ever was to be movement, economics, politics, security form a kind of triangle, and they all meet up here. So, I mean, the basic model that you have very cheap labor, incredibly cheap labor. I mean, you may have labor concerns about that, but they're educated, they're disciplined, they do the stuff. When I hear quotes from the 123 firms working there, they like their labor and so on. It's interesting, though, that you know, there's a tax row at the moment, which is, perhaps we won't go into the detail and so on, but it's quite interesting. I think there's possibly the North. When I read this, you know, there's always the risk of sort of assuming that the North Koreans are the ones to blame, isn't there? So, you know, here they come with the swinging tax thing, you know, they're trying to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. But actually, then it turns out, I can well believe that some South Korean firms are underpricing. All you have to do, because no one's making a profit in there yet. You think, really? They're not making a profit in there yet? Or maybe they're not. But, you know, maybe they're overpricing the inputs, underpricing the outputs, and the North Koreans aren't getting any tax. That is not an impossible situation to me. So stuff like that needs to be sorted out. And obviously there have been bad times. There's sort of crazy demands for a 5-fold wage increase, all these border restrictions and so on. But how amazing this thing survives. Nobody took anybody hostage over the Cheonan and things like that. At some level, there seemed to have been an understanding in both Seoul and Pyongyang that we've actually got something here. Do we know how important it is in the local economy? 50-odd thousand workers, that's a lot of workers. And I'm told they come from further afield than around Kaesong. So why could you not do that elsewhere? Why could you not do it on every single port in North Korea? If the North Koreans were willing, you'd have the same. I mean, the cheap labor advantage surely is cheap, skilled, discipline, and is surely a huge plus, is it not? Then South Korean firms wouldn't have to go to, well, not so many of them would have to go to Haiti and Sri Lanka and everywhere else. You know, they probably saw that this SEZ that was opened with much fanfare in Haiti recently, both Clintons were there. I forget its name. The centerpiece is a South Korean firm I'd never heard of, a small textile firm which is putting up $80 million. I mean, many more, you know, because again, I keep thinking of things I left out, but there isn't time for everything. Again, a point under-recognized, but maybe everyone in this room is well aware. Where are the chaebol in North Korea? Except because Hyundai probably widely seen as losing its shirt. So all the other, the serious Hyundais, now that the empire has broken up, they're not there, and so on, because it's not been made economic for them. Whereas if you had, if you had a better business environment overall, obviously, but more particularly for smaller firms, if you had SEZs and things, I see no reason, I'm happy to be stand corrected, I see no reason why that model could not be replicated.
Great. Yep. Right here. Second row.
Hi, Richard Shin with Economists Incorporated. I'm an economist, so I'm going to ask probably an economic question.
Yeah, and I'm a sociologist, so I won't be able to answer it.
But I will be asking a question about human rights as well. So it's a two-part question. One is that, you know, we talk about markets and economic freedom, but the flip side of this in North Korea is the human rights abuse. So, for example, your paper mentions slave labor as, you know, North Korean labor that's being exported, and so, you know, what's Kim Jong-un's take on that, and what's the likelihood of that type of human rights violation continuing, including, for example, last economic reform they tried with the currency, evaluation. I mean, that wiped out a massive amount of wealth for certain groups of population, and that's another human rights violation in some sense. So that's the first question. Second part is about the Kaesong, and you're talking about chaebol and South Korean involvement. Again, you know, all this economic possibilities are there. I mean, the Russian Sino-Korea pipeline, for example, could be a boon to South Korea. But, you know, in the last conference that I attended, that's impossible because of the political instability and the hold-up issues that are involved in that kind of investment. And this is going to be true with every investment that the South Koreans make in North Korea. So what's Kim Jong-un's take on that, and how would that problem be resolved in terms of getting this South Korean economic involvement in North Korea improved?
That's quite a lot of questions in there, aren't there? Intriguing ones and key ones. I mean, mentioning the pipeline, let me pick that up. I mean, when depressed pessimism of the intelligence, I think, how hard is it to have somebody else build infrastructure across your territory and sit and collect the rent? And from the end you ask it, I mean, someone's going to have to take that risk. Yes, obviously, if you have I'm sure no one in South Korea would ever get into a situation where all or even a significant amount of their natural gas came that way. But pipelines go through the most unexpected and unstable and contentious parts of the world. I really wonder, given again that the far-sighted Chung Ju-yong first, but in the 80s he put this forward, didn't he, on his first trip to Pyongyang? Why everybody says, and particularly then why everybody gets all excited about it August last year, and why exactly we haven't heard about it since. I did read a report in the Joseon that the North Koreans are simply asking too much money. There's going to be risk as far as that goes, isn't there? I mean, and it's true, North Korea's track record is pretty dreadful in terms of expropriations and so on. But I mean, I think that risk has to be taken. The human rights angle is complicated. I mean, I tend to think that labour migration is, although it's tried and tested, in most of the world it's individuals that make these choices, or they often make them in difficult circumstances. All these educated Filipinos running large swathes of the world in different because they can't get jobs at home. In a way, it's suboptimal. And with the North Korea, of course, it has this added twist because it's all governmental. I simply don't know whether it's possible at all to put pressure on them to do it in a different way. If the scale is if China's the place where it's going to expand, then obviously the Chinese are not actually going to do that. I would have thought from the human rights angle, given that no one in North Korea has human rights, and I take your point that the redenomination was a confiscation. It was also a very bad move, luckily, and I think the reaction taught them a lesson. But that's why I think, again, we come back, I think the SEZ model, where people are in their own homes, okay, they come in, they don't get much money, but it's stable, is probably a better one. And I kind of wonder, in a way, why the North Korea is even going down the labour export route rather than having capital in, and giving some sort of guarantees. Have to be a lot of trust to start with, treat them better, and use the labour force at home. Particularly because one of the things I read was that among which you obviously wonder which labour and to do what, the suggestion was that it's sort of young women who are involved in processing on commission trade for Chinese factories were going to go and actually do it in China. And you think, well, why? Why not have it in North Korea?
All right, other questions. Let's go to the back with Chad.
Hi, yeah, we've as you know, we're live streaming the event, and we've had a question come in online from James Pearson, who's the editor of Korea Bang.
Oh, wow.
He would like to ask you, economic development in North Korea is all very well, but positive change relies on positive change in the South too, with the very real potential for Park Geun-hye winning the next election. Are we not headed for years of more of the same, he asks.
Is Park Geun-hye coming back from the grave? Possibly Park Geun-hye. No, we're not in an uncertain world. One of the things I'm absolutely sure of is that we're going to get that Seoul's policy is going to change, because all three candidates say so. Not that I'm credulous enough necessarily to believe politicians of any hue, but I think it's fairly widely recognized, isn't it, that whatever were I could see the theoretical motivations for the Im Young-bak policy, the idea that sunshine was one side and so on, but it would be pretty hard 4 years on to say we're in a better place, really, wouldn't it, on any front in the North-South relationship. So I think everyone's going to try something different. Park Geun-hye put her hat into the ring and put out a marker already, was it last year, with her article in Foreign Affairs about trust politique? I mean, it's another of these terms you can prod with a pin, and obviously we wait to see what it means, but it means I'm not Im Young-bak, which is pretty much what's driving her, isn't it? And as we know, she visited Pyongyang. I'd love to have been a fly on the wall when Kim Jong-il entertained her to dinner. I'm puzzled. North Korea's political judgment and its manners are often suspect. I mean, it's very, very rude about Park Geun-hye. I suppose they want the other guys to win the election, but I mean, if they mean what they say, which is quite often a genuine question, they may not mean it all. But it's Just like last time around, they went on about Yi Huijiang for ages and didn't even notice Lee Myung-bak, it seems. It's funny. But I think, despite what they think of her, I think that they can turn on a dime if they want to. So it's nice to have James Pearson joining us from UK or France or wherever he is at the moment. But no, we're not in for more of the same. I'm absolutely sure we're not going to get more of the same. The South is going to do what it can. Is that good? Well, I think it's probably better than what we've had, but again, I keep finding bits I forgot. I'm slightly worried if the Chinese have had it all to themselves, really, for the last 4 years. South Korea gets back in the game. The Russians, I take you, having finally swallowed whatever, and they've written off all this debt, I think they're probably, it's hard to read Russian policy, frankly, but I think they're back in the game. And I'm worried that this will just encourage rent-seeking behavior. I mean, to use at least one economist's term, in Pyongyang, and that it's resources will go in, but if they go in a way which sort of doesn't encourage reform, and if Kim Jong-un follows his father and grandfather in the age-old game, which has worked quite well for them, in a way, for the regime, if not for the people, of playing off one against the other, then maybe that won't be encourage reform. But I don't know. So probably already too long an answer. I respectfully disagree with Korea Bang on this one.
All right. Up in here in the front.
Ed Gordon. To me, a peculiar example or a special example of North Korean irrationality is the attitude toward Japan. The Japanese have made a big issue of these kidnapped people and so on. You often wonder why they ever kidnapped anybody in the first place, because there was a big Korean community in Japan that was fluent in Japanese, so they didn't need Japanese in effect to do that. And then why they made such an issue of not accepting or not proving what the Japanese wanted, which seems to be relatively a small issue. When hundreds of millions of dollars in reparations, that is grants, the Japanese are prepared to offer, are being held up under the circumstances. So if there's any kind of economic policy that's really stupid, this is one that stands out.
I'm inclined to agree, but yes, I mean, from beginning to end, yes, if you want people to train your spies, yes, you could have just put an ad in the Joseon Shinbo. Well, no, you obviously wouldn't put an ad, would you? But, they were. Is it because of concepts of race and blood that you wanted people who are really Japanese and you go kidnap them? I mean, the whole thing is just so extraordinary. I think, though, that from the way North Korea is, the fact that what was intended to be the resolution of it, which was very daring by North Korean standards, the Koizumi visit, and possibly the only apology that Kim Jong-il ever gave to anybody, and he gave it to the Japanese, the half admission of it, it must have been assumed incorrectly, predictably incorrectly, really, by both Koizumi and Kim Jong-il. It must have been assumed that this would somehow solve it. And as we know, it did the exact opposite. It opened the Pandora's box completely, because the story that the North Koreans gave for the ones that were dead seems pretty implausible, and there's all the bones and everything else. So it now sits, this thing, as a sort of as a complete obstacle. I think there is irrationality on both sides. I mean, this may seem an awful thing to say. I mean, in terms of prioritizing the future as against the past, which sometimes seems difficult even between Japan and South Korea also, but we better not go there, had we? Then I would have thought, if I were a Japanese right now, what would I worry about from North Korea? I think it's the missiles and the nuclear and the other stuff. You can't, in a way, just let it go. But it's so difficult. As you probably know, they've had another try this summer, and the North Koreans are sort of trying to find a way. They found something that, an issue I'm afraid I wasn't even fully aware of before, and which I thought had never been broached before, the many thousands of Japanese who found themselves sort of stranded in northern Korea after 1945, and a number of whom stayed there under various circumstances, probably involuntarily, for a number of years. So there's a small pressure group in Japan of some of these people who were kids in North Korea. Their home was Chongjin, and there are graves and stuff, and the North Koreans have reached out to these people. They were allowed to have a tour, and so you create a tiny little interest group in Japan, which will be nothing against the combined might of all the others on the abductee issue. But yeah, it's true. You say hundreds. I mean, 10 billion is the figure that I've seen. If you've got the equivalent given inflation for what the South Koreans got in 1965, yeah, huge mega bucks could be coming. But I think on both sides, and the state of Japanese politics now as well, I just can't see movement coming on that. It is a real shame. I mean, what would count as closure? The North Koreans probably can't do full disclosure. I imagine that advisors to Kim Jong-il, maybe even he himself, that this really backfired. We made a mistake even apologizing, even admitting anything. That's my fear.
Other questions? Maybe one from myself here. We talked about, you had the Kim Il-sung quote where saying we already opened up. How much of that sentiment do you think is still kind of inside the North Korean leadership? And did that play any part of us not seeing any of the suspected reform announcements after the September SPA?
It's so hard to know. I mean, obviously Kim Il-sung was formed in a different vein, and I don't know quite what he didn't. The broader conversation, I must try and get that up online. It didn't really go any further on that, because they hadn't by then. I suppose we had the Rajin Sonbong zone as it then was, didn't we? It was newish. That I guess that's what he was thinking of. Clearly, under Kim Jong-il, who was shown China and things, although there was a huge gap when he didn't go to China, obviously. But we did, and then we did eventually get sunshine, and we did get first Kumgang, which I didn't spend much time on Kumgang, which I also think was positive and hope will come back again, and Kaesong and so on. So sort of gets it. But again, this is where I simply don't know. There are various good people have been training various North Korean economists in this and that. There are courses, various German foundations go in and out, and so forth. I don't know who these people are. I don't know if they have the ear of Jang Song-taek or Kim Jong-un and so on. But I imagine that anything is, when you've been a system like this, when in particular you looked at the events in the big communist superpowers and you were more worried about the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union, seemingly, than you were encouraged by the success of the transformation in China, then you're going to be incredibly cautious. So in that particular case, what is the precise mix of they don't get what you need to do, or they are cautious about what you need to do? Or actually, when the agricultural thing, which again, I'm sorry I skipped over, but I do say in the paper, and others here know better than I mean, we must avoid dogmatism of left or right. I mean, the idea that if you just gave freedom, capitalist freedom to North Korean farmers, that the food output's suddenly going to double. It's not, is it? Because the earth is shot to pieces. They've really messed up the environmental aspects of agriculture. So if you start raising hopes and then you're not sure, and then there's the more specific economic argument, isn't there? Others can make better than I about Marcus Nolan has made, among others, that precisely because North Korea was a more developed country, it's not like China or Vietnam, where when they started their reform process, there is not still this great reservoir of labor in the countryside to be moved to the cities and to be dynamic in various ways. North Korea is in a different place. So I can think of multiple reasons for caution, quite honestly, if I'm Kim Jong-un. And yet, caution won't cut it in the end.
All right. Else? Yeah. Back up here. Mr. Warren. Coming right here for you. Yep.
I'll take a second question, if I may.
Sure.
Would you give us your assessment of Kim Jong-un today? Is the man able to mobilize the society? Is he in a secure position? What is his relationship to the military?
Again, from my ringside seat in Devon, England, I can't really claim any special insights into this. Obviously, just thinking about it like the rest of us are. I'm intrigued, first of all. You sort of think of the points at which the regime had choices to make. And going back to when coming at this sort of slightly historically, going back to when the moment of Kim Jong-il's death, and there had been predictions that because he's so young or whatever reason, that we would get a move back to a more collective leadership. And so the first thing is that doesn't happen, at least at the symbolic level. Right away, it's, although he's only had 2 years in the public domain, hardly that, he comes, I mean, even the telltale thing on KCNA and elsewhere, Nenara, that he gets the bigger font, like his father and his grandfather. His name is written in bigger letters, and he, in terms of the jobs, okay, he gets commander-in-chief right away. So immediately, it's as if this system now, on its second transition, must have a slot that is called the leader, the supreme leader, no matter if he's really young. Monarchies for centuries have functioned this way, for sure. It's not exactly historically new. It's slightly odd when it comes out of communism, but it's not historically new. So he's the new king, and they do it that way. And there's all the same. We've all seen all the same stuff. He smiles. Isn't it lovely how in death the statues of Kim Jong-il have him beaming and smiling, which he must have smiled when he was a younger man, but we remember, he was ill, he was in pain, he was miserable, wasn't he? So the smiling stuff, the physical stuff, the touchy-feely stuff, even the Mickey Mouse, so we could go on endlessly perhaps about that. The funfairs. It's PR, it's domestic and foreign PR. It's trying to tell us something. In all of this, to know how far he is the master of his own fate, the subject of his own sentences, he doesn't seem like a puppet. I mean, I have no access to intel on any of this, so I'm conscious that I've been doing for all these years. It's a priori reasoning, or comparativist, trying to put stuff together with far too few facts to actually go on. The sudden dismissal of Ri Yong-ho, the military man who had sat between the two, father and son, when Kim Jong-il was alive. I mean, how important can you get? Although his own rise had been pretty sudden before that, hadn't it? They do come and go, these guys. Suggests that somebody, but do we know that that's Kim Jong-un, or do we know that it's the party reinserting itself? Is it Jang Song-taek? It's really hard to know. But I get the impression that he's quite strong. I get the impression, I'm watching him do the speech and stuff, it's that he sort of knows what he's doing, even though to say he didn't write it isn't to say anything, because nobody writes their own speeches at that level, do they? I'm still trying to be cautiously optimistic, but I'm worried that I don't know whether he gets the economy. I don't know whether he is the prisoner of having to, because obviously he wouldn't be in the job if he wasn't the son and grandson of who he is. Therefore, continuity has to be stressed. I am disappointed in the works that I've read, the land management one. I say that the single interesting sentence in it, in my view, is the one that I quoted. Otherwise, it's all about how we must spruce it all up. Everybody must make everything look more beautiful, sort of polishing the silver type stuff. That's not what North Korea needs. I mean, if we could just get an economic work out of him. His father was capable, or his grandfather. I haven't read enough Kim Jong-il, I must confess. At a certain point, I thought I'd rather play with my baby son than read any more. But Kim Il-sung back in the day, or somebody in his name, could write stuff. It wasn't all like the one that I quote on the front, which is more or less sort of telling people not to be lazy. I mean, he could do stuff that I would recognize as economics. And I'm sort of waiting for some of that to come back, but I just don't know enough. Bradley does, anybody does, as to where those people are that are going to do that. But I think I'm thinking he's secure, that they've managed a second transition. And on the broader frame, I, who used to be a collapsist, have finally taken Bruce Cummings's jibe to heart. Is there a sort of statute of limitations on collapsism? I think no, it probably won't. That would be a wider argument. I think the Chinese have made a strategic decision to prop it up, and I think China is like Lola in the song. Whatever China wants, China gets.
Question over here in the back. Yep.
Thanks. I'm Charles Bloom, IAS Group. Could I pick up on the point you just made, the point you started with, the point you just made about the North Koreans not getting economics? You suggested maybe, Kim Il-sung did. Where does this come from? I mean, who gets it and who doesn't get it? So specifically, my question is, what do you think is going on right now in terms of outside training, outside access to the elites and the senior bureaucracy? What's going on in terms of training in market-oriented kinds of things, and what's the potential for that to help the North Koreans get it?
I think the more of that, the merrier. But my sense is that what counts as quite a lot, I don't know, maybe it isn't really in the scheme of things a lot, but at least for since the 1980s, there have been bits of this. Okay, the article I alluded to in NK News, admittedly it started with, in the 80s we had the language training more, but certainly in the 90s, was it Park Kyung-ae at UBC wrote an article where she actually rounded up, and I've seen other things too at various times, none very recently, that there was, you could find a couple of dozen programs, usually in different places. They sent economists to Australia fairly regularly. I think the Swedes are financing something that takes place in Vietnam. Various of the German foundations, particularly Hans Seidel, are in there all the time organizing programs. You've now got NGOs like Joseon Exchange, which, as I understand, is a sort of purely volunteer effort. Yeah, a young Singaporean, a young Brit, and their friends doing good work, I think, and writing about it, I think, very interestingly on their website. With no illusions about it, but they're sort of hanging on in there. But what I don't have a sense of is who these people are, where they go, if they have power in the society, where it's all actually ending up. And I'm not, admittedly, I'm a shameful, bad, in a sense, non-reader of Korean for all practical purposes. So, but when I see bits of Kyungjae-yonggu, I don't recognize it as, I'm not an economist, but I don't recognize it really as economics. So I just don't have a sense of although my point in the paper is more about the public domain not having economics, I just don't know. There are faculties at the university. People get PhDs at Kim Il-sung University in economics. I just don't know enough about what that consists of, but it doesn't seem to percolate into the way they talk about them. By contrast, and in a footnote I left out, you may think there are quite enough in there already, but which I particularly shouldn't have done because it's here. I mean, the excellent paper, I've forgotten the guy's name already, he compares North Korea and Cuba. Raul Castro, after reading, it's just like, when you go out of Pyongyang, Beijing suddenly seems like heaven and normal. Reading Raul Castro, he's a serious, sensible economist. He says, we can't afford it. He says things like, you guys are going to be out of work. I mean, more or less in those words. What we're doing doesn't work. Simple phrases like that. Is it impossible that North Korea will ever say these things? They managed to admit the environmental stuff. So finding, I don't know if people think I'm emphasizing discourse too much, but I think finding a way to say the things that need to be said maybe precedes finding a way to do them. If you can't properly say them in the public domain, you have a real problem. That's why, obviously it was easier in China. Mao was gone. You didn't have the hereditary thing. You had a new regime saying stuff like to get rich is glorious and doesn't matter what color the cat is and so forth. Kim Jong-il had his moment of this. In the original draft of this, I called it a Max Bygraves moment. I was told no one in this country knows a Max. He was a Cockney comedian recently who wrote a song called Things Ain't What They Used to Be. And do you remember there were those Kim Jong-il maxims that came and went? Speed of light in 2002, 2003, I have it there. Things are not the same as they were in the last century. We must do things differently. And we all read this and thought, yes, 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 and then it didn't go anywhere. So they can do it if they want to. Sorry, that isn't quite the same as full economic discourse, but it's finding a way to say new times demand new methods. They seem to find a way to say things like that, but I keep waiting for the next bit and for it to be sustained, and to sort of issue in substantial economic policies that sort of start from the fact that economics is a science. We do have this problem. You could even blame it on the foreigners, whatever, but, and we've got to tackle it. And I'm not hearing any of that still under Kim Jong-un. But maybe he's still got the politics to do. Sorry.
Back up here in the front.
I'm asking the second question here again. I already asked two questions, but I just want to pick up on what you said just now, that that they can do it if they want to, and the problem is they don't want to. Giving economic freedom and importing market economy allows certain freedoms to the public that will, I guess my understanding is that undermine their regime, and that's the reason why they're not importing it. So the question is, what would incentivize them to want these types of reform that you think that they could actually carry out? Now, I actually don't believe that they could carry this out. I mean, looking at their currency reform, and it's disastrous. There was no economics involved in any of those policies that they were following. I also heard from an ex-Korean ambassador to the United States. He said, North Korea is a political state. They don't think about economics, and he was talking about. That's
kind of my point, I think. Yeah.
I mean, he was talking about a visit to North Korea where, they were expending all this amount of money for. I mean, it was economically very inefficient, and they had no concept of that. It was just politically, you are invited by such and such, therefore we do all these things, regardless of what the economic efficiency requires.
Yeah, that's interesting too, all of that. I mean, I am worried, perhaps I'm repeating myself now, that, yeah, the North Korea as a regime doesn't say it's the economy is stupid, it's the polity, and the Kim Jong-il quote pretty much says it. But at the end of the day, somebody has to pay the bills. And even in North Korea, or maybe they don't, which is often the issue. There's somebody in finance, so they have the finance function has to be done somewhere in all societies, and so somebody has to actually say that. But in terms of what would incentivize them, I would hope fear of the alternative, although the fact that the regime, against the predictions of many, including me in the past, does keep going, maybe buoys them up to think they can just go on doing it. You would think, I mean, again, I think it's a real question to which I don't know the answer, why they are not more encouraged by the Chinese, or say more similar in scale, the Vietnamese experience. I mean, people have taken them to see this stuff a lot over the last 30 years. And what is that if it's not? It's a communist party finding a way to retain political power, to get the dynamism of a market society while maintaining political control. Now, obviously, both China and Vietnam are works in progress. And maybe already the freedoms, the limited freedoms, but real greater freedoms that exist in both those societies are already anathema to North Korea. I'm sure they were to Kim Jong-il. One would hope Kim Jong-un, with his wider education, would be different. But you'd have thought those examples were encouraging, wouldn't you? China's doing pretty well. Vietnam is doing pretty well. That there must be people who think we could do that. They're not close to Vietnam, are they? Again, there was a visit, the first for years, wasn't there, with the Vietnamese leadership, and it's just not. I can imagine what the Vietnamese think of the North Koreans, but maybe it's mutual.
More worried than encouraged.
But the dynamism, there's money, there's growth, and it used to be a growth story. That's the thing. They were proud of their economy. They had things to be proud of. The process whereby I'd be intrigued, in a sense, the intellectual and political history as well as the economic history, whereby, because the economy went down the tube, said, okay, we're the bomb, we are the party, and so forth. I suppose it was always a hyper-politicized and a militarized society, but it was about the economy.
Claire?
Keep hoping it will be
Maybe
again.
last question here.
Hi. I was wondering, on a grassroots sort of level, if you've heard of anything about microfinancing under this regime, or if you just focused on the broader...
Probably, I think Bradley knows this one. There is some microfinancing, isn't there? And I don't know enough about it. There are projects. Could I hand that one over to Bradley, perhaps? I probably should do the whole talk. But, there's a New Zealand one, isn't there?
There was a few years ago before it was shut down, but there was a very successful NGO-based microfinance for small enterprises in the Pyongyang area, where they made over 900 loans and had over 90% repayment rates. And there's an awful lot of entrepreneurship taking place inside North Korea that doesn't get much external publicity.
So when was that, and why did it get shut down?
Well, I mean, it started during the period when the economic reforms were in favor. And then in 2006, when they fell out of favor and the reformist prime minister and his colleagues were deposed, and that's when they headed down the missile and the nuclear tests, then these kind of experimentations fell out of favor at the same time and slowly died off. So what we've seen is a pendulum of being more open to these sort of reforms and then more against them over the course of the last decade. And the question now is, are they going to be, pendulum going to be swinging back towards a more rational reform mentality or not? And that's the big question that I think everyone's asking right now.
I very much agree with that, and that reminds me that, again, an extra footnote that should have been in there definitely is to Bob Carlin and Joel Witt's Delphi paper for IISS, which does show that in Gyeonggi-Yongo, even though it's kind of not what we would take as economics, but there was a very real debate, wasn't there? I mean, so in that sense, I've perhaps been sounding too pessimistic. There clearly are people who do get it, who do realize what needs to be done. Under Park Pong-ju, they had their moment. One can be encouraged that he's back again. But clearly, as of now, is not the moment, maybe because the priority is politically just making sure that Kim Jong-un is stable. But I keep being, maybe next year the pendulum will swim back again. But I hope it's Can we get a pendulum that's also a spiral? Because pendulums that go side by side, we never make progress, do we? I'll have to get a more complicated geospatial metaphor here, but it'd be nice to think that the pendulum would move forward and would never move back again, in which case the clock would stop. No. Try another metaphor.
Well, I think our clock has stopped here. So first, I want to thank all of you for coming, especially with the crazy weather and the postponement of the original event. This has been a great look at North Korea's economy after the death of Kim Jong-il. A lot of great discussion and great topics, all different points that I think people are looking at to try and figure out exactly what's going to happen. And like I mentioned, we have 2 parts. So in December, we'll have that second part looking at North Korea after Kim Jong-il with Dr. Hyung-gu Lin from the University of British Columbia coming in to talk to us about the political and security aspects of North Korea after Kim Jong-il. So stay tuned for more information on that. And now please join me in thanking Aidan Foster-Carter for this great talk and discussion.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks again, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you for the questions. That's great.
Thanks, Aidan. Appreciate it.
Is that okay?
Definitely.